हेलो दोस्तों, वेलकम बैक टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल। टुडे आई एम गोइंग टू डिस्कस one of the most important feature of that overriding with respect to exception. Means if your method is going to throw the exception, then how it will work with respect to overriding, whether it is going to be work properly or it is going to throw some error, right? So these concepts we are going to discuss. But before going to that concept, let's discuss about on a very high level what is checked exception, what is unchecked exception. That is a very important thing because this is going to help you to understand that overriding with respect to exception. So as you know that throwable is the parent class of all the exception, right? So this is a throwable. This is the parent class for all the exception, and it is having two children. One is called exception and other is called error. Okay, exception further having many children. One is called runtime exception, one is your IO exception, one is your SQL exception. There might be many more, right? I just named few one. Similarly, error is also having one children, like out of memory error, and there might be many more. Correct. Again, this runtime exception is having further many children. One is arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, array index of bound exception, and likewise your IO exception is also having a many one. File not found exception, end of file exception, lot of things, right? Now how you came to know which is the checked exception and which is the unchecked exception? So first of all, let me know you guys the definition of checked and unchecked exception. Checked exception, those exception who arises at the compile time, that is called the checked exception. The unchecked exception, or sometimes it is called a runtime exception. So runtime exception is going to be arises at the runtime. So these are called the runtime exception or unchecked exception. Now I'm going to draw a line something like that. See, so this one and this one, correct? These I draw these two areas, right? Now let's consider what is happening. I'll explain here. Okay. So these area are called unchecked exception, or this is called the checked exception. So these complete area is the checked exception and rest is the unchecked exception. So it means arithmetic exception is unchecked, null pointer exception unchecked, array index bound exception unchecked, any error is coming, that is the unchecked. Correct? This concept is clear? Perfect. Now I am going to discuss about the rule. What is the rule? Correct. So simple rule is that going to discuss the rule that is very important. I'm going to write over here. Rule is that if child class method is throwing any checked exception, I explained already what is checked and what is unchecked. So if child class method is throwing any checked exception, then parent class method must have throw either same exception or its parent. Okay, that is the very important rule. Second rule is that runtime exception. Runtime exception or unchecked exception these are going to be ignored by overriding. It means if any method is throwing unchecked exception, overriding simply ignore it, right? Now what I will do, I will took some case and explain one by one, right? So what I'm going to do, let's say, first of all, I'm not going to write the complete signature because it is going to take a lot of time. So let's say first use case I'm going to take, this is the parent method. Method name is M1 and suppose that it is throwing exception, throws exception. Similarly, this is the child one and M1, correct? This is the use case number one. So whether it is the valid use case or not, this is the valid because child is not throwing any exception. If child is throwing exception, then parent must to throw the same exception. Or see, if child class method throwing any checked exception, then parent must throw either same exception or its parent. But in this case, child is not throwing exception, so only parent is throwing. So child may or may not. So this is the valid use case, not a problem. Correct. Similarly, let's say coming to that second use case. In a parent, this is the method M1 and in child, same method M1 and it is throwing exception. Correct. This is the use case number 2. Is it a valid or not? It is not valid because since child is throwing exception, then parent must have to throw the exception, but here parent is not throwing any exception, so this is not the valid use case. Again, come to the third use case. In a parent, M1 is throwing exception, child as well throwing the exception, right? So in this case, both is throwing same exception, so this is the valid use case, not a problem. Okay, but again, let me take one more use case. This is the M1 and this is going to throw IO exception, and this is the child and child is throwing exception. Will it be a valid use case or not? Think about that one. This is not the valid use case. Why? As per definition, come to the definition, come to the rule, right? The rule is what? If child class method throwing any checked exception, okay, child is throwing exception, then parent class must have throw either same exception or its parent. But IO exception is not the parent of exception. IO exception is the child of exception. If you can see that hierarchy, see here. IO exception is a child of exception, right? That is why this is not a valid use case. So to make it valid, either it has to throw the IO exception, either that child also need to throw the IO exception, or parent throw the exception, right? If I'll reverse this condition, right? So it will work something like that. If I'm going to reverse this use case, something like that. M1 throws exception and child as well. M1 throws IO exception. So this is the valid use case because child is throwing IO exception and parent is throwing exception. So this exception is the parent of IO exception. So this is the valid use case. Correct? Now let's discuss couple of more scenarios, right? This is the parent, and inside parent it is throwing SQL exception, and child one is throwing IO exception. What will happen? Will it be the valid use case? No, because that SQL exception and IO exception don't have any relationship. See here, if you will see here, so IO exception and SQL exception don't have any relationship, right? That is why this is not the valid use case. Okay. Now come to the one more use case. Let's say this is the M1 in a parent class and M1 in the child class, and in child class it is throwing null pointer exception. You remember whether it is a valid or not? It is valid because the rule number 2, second rule, runtime exception or unchecked exception, these are going to be ignored by overriding. So simply overriding is going to ignore this runtime exception. So this is the valid use case. Similarly, one more use case is there. M1 throws exception in a parent class, right? And in child class, M1 throws, let's say, null pointer exception. Okay. Will it be the valid? Yes. Simply overriding, simply ignore this one, right? So this is the valid use case. But this is the very important use case, M1, and this is the last one. M1 throws null pointer exception, and child is throwing exception. Will it the valid use case? No, because as per rule 2, null pointer exception is going to be ignored. So if it is going to be ignored null pointer exception, then ultimately it will become something like that. M1 and M1 throws exception. So if child is throwing exception, then parent must have to throw either same exception or its child one. So that is why this use case is not valid use case. Okay. So I hope I covered all that scenarios related to overriding and exception. Even though if you have any issue, any concern, let me know in a comment section. I will definitely try to answer your all questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.